We're in week 14. I'm Dan Titus. That's Justin Henry. Now let's get to the points. Before we do, make sure you join a Yahoo Fantasy Basketball Public League because you will be entered to win a $100 e-gift card that you can spend at the NBA store. So why not try it? Join with your friends, join a public league, have some fun, join the Fantasy Basketball League today. Now, man, Justin, we got to talk about it. This has just been a crazy week in basketball, and it's only Wednesday, and we've had a 70-point night, 62-point night. We've had coaches getting fired, trades happening. Everything's going down in the NBA right now. I completely forgot. Is NFL still going on? Because, I feel like all eyes are on basketball right now.
Bro, it's been crazy, man. Seeing the scoring outputs, we're getting triple doubles, game winners, bad officiating at times. It's been fun to watch on the product in the NBA with some of these major trades. There's going to be some really competitive games coming down, but seeing how these guys perform on the anniversary of 81 from my guy Kobe, man, it was good to see these players take that day and really have a chance to show off a little bit, especially when it comes to Embiid dropping 70, man. That was crazy.
Yeah, it really was, man. In honor of Kobe, 18 years ago, he dropped 81 points. And I guess they understood the assignment, that being Joel Embiid and Karl Anthony Towns. I think I came away more impressed with what Joel Embiid did, though. You know, he became the Sixers' all-time scoring leader in a game at 70 points. But he dropped 18 rebounds as well as 5 assists. And that was actually the 6th highest fantasy points scored in a game since 1970. Now, this is before, Wilt. We're not calculating Wilt and Elgin Baylor's into this number here, but this is the second time Embiid has dropped over 100 fantasy points in a game, man. That's insane.
When I look at this day and, we start talking about the high scoring outputs, the only thing I'm ashamed of is why aren't these guys doing it on a daily basis for our fantasy teams, right? Shouldn't every day be 81 for Kobe? If we can get 60 out of Cat, we can get 70 out of Embiid. Now we can get game winners out of KD. We get 39 out of Tatum. I want these guys to treat every day like it's Kobe day, like it's Kobe 81 day, so our fantasy teams can enjoy the fruits of this, my man.
Yeah, I feel like if you had Cat or Joel Embiid on your rosters, you're probably feeling pretty good midweek right now, absolutely dominating. But yeah, man, it's crazy because on one side I was Joel Embiid had this celebratory moment, and then you look at Cat and they lose that game and in dramatic fashion, and I feel like everybody, the coach, Anthony Edwards, was just ripping on Karl Anthony Towns, man. I feel like he can never win.
He's one of those guys then where it's he wants to be a part of this upper echelon, even in fantasy. It's we draft him to be this guy. We expect him to be this top 10, 15 guy. And it always feels like he falls short, but it was good to see him get hot in the early on in the game. But when you start chasing stuff towards the end, that's unfortunately where things fall off. So I love the effort. Love that we're getting 60 out of him, but you always want to see if it's going to be in the spirit of my guy Black Mamba, it's got to be in a win. It was 81 in a win against the Raptors. You got to get the dub, my man.
Yeah, so even though Cat was scorching hot in the first half, 44 points, I want to stick to a team that's still scorching hot, man. I think at a surprise mood. I didn't expect the Miami Heat to trade for Terry Rozier, but they did it. And if you look at the numbers, man, Terry's putting up similar numbers to Damian Lillard, and they got him at a fraction of the cost. So I got to feel like this is a really good real-life basketball move. Is there any other basketball moves or trades that you think that could happen that you could see now that this first domino fell for the Charlotte Hornets, who are clearly going to be sellers by the deadline?
Yeah, I'm not sure about for this Hornets team. I'm sure something's going to come out of it. But when we look at the deadline, obviously things are going to get real spicy here, right? We saw Pascal Siakam get traded. We've seen OG Anunoby get traded, Terry Rozier. So in the Eastern Conference, there's already been some dominoes to fall. And I think in the Western Conference, especially with some of these older veteran teams, seeing the way that OKC is pushing the pace, seeing the way that Minnesota is pushing the pace. You got Denver. We already know how much of a threat they are. Some of these older teams are going to be looking and wanting to get in that picture. And my Los Angeles Lakers are probably the team that's going to be making the first move. A lot of talk about D'Angelo Russell, a lot of talk about Austin Reeves being moved. And potentially for me, when I look at DeJounte Murray, the name Donovan Mitchell's been thrown out there, Trae Young, as a fantasy player, I don't really want to see any of those guys leave their current situations because they're all really fantasy-friendly setups. But as a Laker fan, if I could bring one and still hold some fantasy value, DeJounte Murray seems like the type of player that would, elevate his game with the trade to the Lakers. I think that he wouldn't be suppressed. He wouldn't feel like a third option. he kind of fits in defensively. He'll still give you the same. Efficiency-wise, he'll still give you the same. And there won't be a huge drop-off in scoring because we know that LeBron and AD sometimes like to take nights off. So for me, I'm going with DeJounte Murray. I feel like he would be a really good fit fantasy-wise and real-life-wise for the Los Angeles Lakers.
Yeah, I feel like if DeJounte went to the Lakers, he'd probably be more of the same fantasy player that he is now. Like I would expect, 25-5 with maybe almost 2 steals. I do feel like he would raise the floor for the Lakers though. And like D'Lo's been playing outstanding, like crazy ever since he's been inserted in the starting lineup. 27 points. Like this guy's playing like he's got his next bag coming up. And I feel like DeJounte Murray is a person that is going to be star power enough for LeBron to be happy. Maybe he'll continue to play some games, but then I think they got to work out some contractual things because I think, the Atlanta Hawks are trying to get Austin Reeves as a part of that deal. Is he untouchable to you? Because like if you're getting DeJounte Murray, like
I think we saw the ceiling for Austin Reeves last year. And, you want complementary pieces, but you kind of need another guy that can hold their own, a 20-point type player. And I think Austin Reeves is probably on the outskirts of being a 20 to 25-point scorer. Let me ask you this, though, Dan, because there's been some other names, and fantasy-wise, they would have some huge, huge implications. If Trae Young or Donovan Mitchell, you can talk about either, one of those two were to go to the Lakers, do you see them carrying the same fantasy value that they have on their current teams?
I feel like Trae Young is pretty much untouchable. Like, I feel like his skill set, like he's always, playing with LeBron and AD, I feel like his 10 assists a game would be almost guaranteed. And if anything, I feel like LeBron wants to do less facilitation, right? Like he was forced to play point guard just because they don't have anybody. So I feel like that's their most glaring need. To get Donovan Mitchell, I feel like it's just to get another 25-point score. That's nice. But I feel like Trae Young would actually be a little bit more dynamic with that offense. Just the way that he can pass and be more of a true point guard at times, but then also knock down those critical clutch buckets that they need. What didn't make a lot of sense initially was the Bucks firing Adrian Griffin and hiring Doc Rivers on Wednesday. Just that quick. You go from having won 30 games out of 43 to being sent to the street and replaced with Doc Glenn Rivers. Like, what do you think this does from a fantasy perspective?
I think it's, you bring in a little bit of experience, you bring in a coach who's respected, and when you lose respect in the locker room, it's tough, whether you're getting wins or not. Sometimes it's just tough to man the ship. And when you got a lot of new pieces in there, you have a team that lost a little bit of identity, losing Drew Holiday, but you bring in extra talent with Damian Lillard. Sometimes it's tough to get on the right page, to have everybody feeling confident, and we've seen handle big personalities in the past. Now, whether these are championships or not, that's a whole nother story. But bringing in Doc Rivers, I think he'll actually have some pretty big fantasy implications for our teams coming up here.
So one of the things I was trying to look at is like what went wrong with Adrian Griffin, and like all signs are pointing to the defensive lapses that the Bucks have had. And one of the things that Dan Devine, Yahoo senior writer, pointed out was there was a specific game where Griffin had, Brook Lopez out trapping pick and rolls and stuff like that, playing super aggressive. And then the next game he plays drop coverage and he has like 8 blocks. So one of the people that I'm expecting to benefit from this is Brook Lopez defensively. His blocks aren't what they were last year, but he's still very solid. Like Brook Lopez is a top 30 fantasy player. If his blocks go up now that he's committed to playing drop coverage like he did, like Doc Rivers instituted for Joel Embiid last year, maybe we'll see some spike in Brook Lopez's production there. But the other person I'm looking at is Damian Lillard. One thing that Doc Rivers does do is he gets his best players the ball, and a lot. James Harden and Joel Embiid's pick and roll was unstoppable last year. Maybe we see more of that now with Doc Rivers there. And I'm curious to see what he does from an offensive mindset hiring, because like Terry Stotts was there in the beginning of the season. He left because he couldn't deal with Adrian Griffin, which was another red flag. So what offensive mind they bring in there, I think that they're going to try to unlock more of Damian Lillard and play more to his system that he's used to. And then maybe we'll see, maybe a version of Damian Lillard that was more like last season, his ceiling more than like his floor, which he's averaging right now, 25, 6. That's what you expect from Dame, but we need to see that next level of Dame. And I think Doc might be able to bring that out.
I'm hoping you're right. I do think Giannis is about to go crazy in the second half when it comes fantasy-wise. We saw what Embiid was with Doc Rivers, and Doc Rivers is going to lean on Giannis hard. This is a player now that I think has top 15, depending on your league setup, has a top 15 type of finish in store for him, because I think his usage is about to go crazy. If I was going to guess that one player that was going to struggle, it'd be Chris Middleton, who earlier on in the season, obviously we knew he was struggling, but he started to pick it up a little bit here in the middle of the season with his scoring output. And I kind of think this is the time where we're going to see Damian Lillard, Giannis have a lot of two-man game, and Chris Middleton's going to be a very inconsistent fantasy asset the rest of the way.
Yeah, I feel like the market for Chris Middleton's been all over the place. Like, I wasn't on him in the beginning of the season. I thought he was being overdrafted at his draft spot, just based on the injury history. But now, with Doc Rivers as your coach, what happened to Tobias Harris? You know what I'm saying? Them number 3 options don't do too well in Doc Rivers' system. So I feel like if you got Chris Middleton, you might want to wait for a 20.5-5 effort and ship him out of there, because I don't have much faith in Chris going forward. But like, one person that I feel like kind of got disrespected by mid-season was Tyus Jones. And we talked about him, months ago. He was one of my breakout candidates. You were high on him. I think you might have even drafted him in the league that we're in, and you dropped him. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah. Hey, sometimes so you got to make first place moves. You know what I mean? And sometimes there's little casualties,
first place moves,
things you don't do right. But yeah, Tyus Jones, man, that was the worst drop I've had all season. Put it that way.
Yeah, and guess lucky for me, I picked him up. I drafted him in a couple of spots, held firm. He really only had one bad month, and that was in November, where he averaged 10 points with 5 assists. And since then, man, he's been absolutely outstanding, man. This guy's a top 30 player. He's up to 14 points a game, 7 dimes. He's just coming off a double-double. This is a guy that I think got a lot of disrespect, but I think he's finally coming around. The one thing that I'm hoping doesn't hurt his fantasy value going forward for the rest of the season is getting traded, which I think is actually a really high possibility, just considering how bad the Wizards are and what he could do for a contending team. Now, the resources, the assets to make it happen, that part, I don't know. But I'm hoping that he stays with the Wizards, because right now, this guy's enjoying a career year. Highest points per game, highest assists. He's really coming into his own.
Yeah, we've heard, I'm sure with every single player in the National Basketball Association, we've heard Lakers attached to the name Tyus Jones. And he's been a player, you talk about underrated guys. This is how you win championships, especially if you're a team in the middle of the pack and you want to go target players who are underrated or maybe don't have the name value. Tyus Jones has been an underrated player his entire career. Even when he was in Memphis, this is a player you could find off of waivers, and he would give you a good amount of good efficiency, good assists. And now he's up to scoring us slightly since he's been in Washington. But Tyus Jones, man, an underrated asset in the fantasy community just in general. Sometimes there's guys that find their place in the top 30, and we don't respect them as good fantasy players because they're not great NBA players. And I think, it's tough to find that balance of fantasy versus real. And to be honest, he's an elite level point guard when it comes to fantasy.
Yeah. Assist to turnover ratio. I mean, he's a good real life point guard and a really solid fantasy point guard as well. Another player, CJ McCollum, is top 20 now. He's officially 16th in per game value. Did you see that coming? And I feel like no one really talks about how great of a season CJ McCollum is having after such a serious injury or ailment that he had, in the middle of the season.
CJ's always kind of had that, where he's been underrated in the fantasy community because normally he's behind Lillard, but since he's come to New Orleans, he's taken on this point guard role. And I don't think we've been giving that enough credence. On a per game basis, when you're a top 20 player, like that should be in the fantasy community, that should be notarized, right? Like we should know that. And I don't think there's enough people that even know he's probably in that range. And, to be averaging 20 and 4 and 5 with the efficiency that he has, to get a steal a game, to get 3 threes plus a game, right? Like this is an elite player. And you were getting him in the 5th round, 6th round, able to snag him up. So I think CJ McCollum, one of the more underrated fantasy players, he kind of, he's a player that is on a lot of teams, especially late. He's on a lot of championship and playoff teams because you can get him without having, that's name value you can get without having to pay name value price. CJ McCollum is an all-star player. And it's like to get that the 6th, 7th round sometimes. I like CJ, bro.
Yeah, man, the value's been great, man. I mean, I think he's probably been you could argue one of the best values of the season. I mean, it's the efficiency that he's doing it with too, right? Like he's shooting 47%. Like I feel like when most people were drafting CJ, they're thinking they're probably going to have to punt that field goal percentage over the last couple of years. But also what he's doing defensively, man, 2 stocks. I don't think I expected CJ McCollum to average almost a block a game on top of, a steal and a little bit over a steal. So I think that's the biggest difference for me is like I didn't anticipate him being that much of an impact defensively as he's been on top of the scoring and the dimes that we're pretty used to. But we'll see what happens with the Pelicans, man. They're going to have a contract situation coming up where maybe Herb Jones and Trey Murphy are both going to hit that rookie scale. So they're going to have to figure out what to do because they're not going to be able to afford all these players. So I'd be curious to see if like they move one of these pieces and then hopefully maybe that gives out some more fantasy value across that starting lineup because they're just so loaded. This team is so deep, man. Like Larry Nance can't even 5 minutes now, right? Like it's a great Pelican squad. So I'm curious to see where they can take this if they can all stay healthy.
Yeah, it's a deep team, and CJ is the leader of this team right now, veteran wise. I think he's in a good spot, and I can't wait to see how this thing plays out in the Western Conference for the Pelicans because this is the team they looked scary last year and they weren't even at full strength. So to see this team being led by CJ, and it's crazy. We talked about the blocks. Like I think in fantasy, that's one thing we don't give enough credence to as well is looking for players that are outside of their position that do things. They play outside their position, right? So for CJ McCollum, like he's averaging almost a block a game. Another player who does that is like James Harden, or when you can find a guard, right? A point guard who averages 5 or 6 rebounds. Those little differences when you can perform outside of what the typical player does at your position, if you're an outlier in certain stats, sometimes that helps you a lot, especially in category leagues, and it makes your team a little bit more sneaky. So that's one habit. Like Damian Lillard, we talked about him when it comes to the Bucks. He's always been like a five rebound type player, 4 or 5 rebound type player. Steph Curry, always been a high rebounding player for point guards. You look at centers, obviously Jokic, but there's other centers that get you 3 or 4 assists. I tend to look for outliers at the position. I think it gives you a leg up against your competition in fantasy.
Totally agree with that, man. And just to echo that, I feel like that's why I like players like Chris Dunn. I picked him up on several teams recently over the last week and a half because in January, this dude's averaging over two stocks a game, but it's really the blocks, man. He's got over a block a game. He's at 17 blocks in 12 games in January. Coming from a guard spot, like that's cheat code territory, right? And especially if you're getting injuries to people like Isaiah Hartenstein or other bigs that went down. So yeah, man, you can't speak enough about those guards that play bigger than their position and actually get you those defensive stats that you would normally expect from a big man.
When you got the big man stuff too, and it sucks. Like when you don't get those stats, there's players that are kind of overrated because they don't get that. Like one player for me, Julius Randle. This is a guy that was a consensus top 40 pick, and we were picking him a lot because of his points, rebounds, and assists. But one area, he's not a great efficiency player, but he doesn't get you those stocks. He doesn't get you over a block a game. He's not getting you over a steal a game. He's a high turnover guy. And so when you talk about a player who's outside of the top 150, when you're drafting this guy to be one of the elite players for your team, the hogs for your team, it sucks when you're not able to get that production and bringing OG Anunoby in. It's like, I don't really see the upside for him to finish this season as even a top 75 player. So Julius Randle has kind of gone from like underrated, kind of disrespected to now in the fantasy community. I think we overvalue what he's able to do on a week in, week out basis.
Yeah, I feel like I would still take that ranking that looks awful and use that to my advantage to get somebody that puts numbers on the board. Like the one thing that Julius Randle does is he gets counting stats, whether it's points, rebounds, the assists. Yeah, the defensive numbers aren't really there, but I mean, he can give me 20 and 12 any given night, and I'll take that. And for how much Tom Thibodeau plays the Knicks starters, and he's the number 2 option now that, RJ Barrett's clearly out the way. They got OG Anunoby's more of a defensive guy. Like, I feel like this whole offense is Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle. So he may be overrated in terms of the fact that you drafted him in like the 5th round, but I feel like he's still a very productive fantasy player. In points leagues, I love Julius Randle. So he's in a little bit of a slump. I'm not worried about it. I'm more worried about Mikal Bridges. And yeah, this dude just went off for 30 points. So you're probably looking at me like I'm crazy, but I feel like fantasy managers are drafting him in the 2nd round. And, this is off of the strength of him averaging 26 points a game as a member of the Brooklyn Nets last year. He's not coming close to that this year. The Nets are terrible. And I think his plays is coming kind of going along with it. And, he's only averaging like 21 points this year. The rebounds and the assists are pretty comparable to years past, but the stocks are down. If Mikal Bridges isn't giving you the stocks or the efficiency that he has in the past, he's overrated.
Yeah, it's tough playing for an organization that's not winning basketball games, and coming off of Olympic, being out there for the Olympics. It's like you want to play winning basketball, meaningful basketball, and this Brooklyn Nets team getting Knicks cheers at home. It's a bad fit overall. And like you mentioned, this is a guy we depended on for those stocks. Like that's why you go get Mikal Bridges, and if you're not providing that, for me, like that's kind of a sign of like, hey, you're a little overrated in my book now. So hopefully there's a chance for him to right the ship, but I just don't see it. It would take a major move, I think, on the Nets' part to either get some players that are competitive, or maybe it's a ship out on his end. But it's looking like a lost season for Mikal Bridges, unfortunately.
Yeah, him and Cam Johnson both struggling. Curious to see what the Nets do at the deadline, because they're at that point where it's like they're not really in the position to win, but they're also like not trying to sell assets. Yeah, so let's see what the Nets decide to do near the deadline. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back every week to get you the points.